Hello and welcome to our Spotlight session, Talent Considerations in M&A. I'm Steve Gelsey, Senior Reporter at The Deal and the moderator for this panel. The need to acquire innovation capabilities and fill skill gaps is now on par with traditional M&A triggers such as industry or geographic expansion. In order to maximize M&A value, companies need to address the talent side of the equation as a deal progresses, not just in the aftermath. Let's welcome our two panelists. We've got Michael Benyamin, Managing Director in Accenture's Talent and Organization Human Potential Practice. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.
And we've got Jay Neely, Managing Director, Mergers and Acquisitions Lead, Accenture. So this session is going to, Jay, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
This session will examine different organization and talent approaches in depending on the type of deal and how companies can use advanced technologies to facilitate faster, better organization design and ultimately derive more value from their deals. So let's move on to the first topic. Jay, human capital equation in M&A broadly. Let's start out with how M&A talent strategy is evolving.
Yeah, certainly, Steve. Look, I think it's a really important topic, and it always has been in M&A. I mean, it's always about bringing companies together and people. But what we think is really different now is the human capital equation in so many of these deals is the equation for how you actually capture value. And so much of when if you went back 30, 40 years ago and you're doing heavy industry consolidation and buying assets, I mean, a lot of the capital of business was actually capital. And if you look at the kinds of businesses that trade today, a lot of the capital is in people's brains. And we're seeing it, and no industry is really sort of immune from that. We see all kinds of industrials doing digital deals. We see massive life sciences coming together and blending biotech with pharma. We see big plays around fintech, right? And all these things sort of bring together the notion of digital and people. And in that kind of world, if of course you'll create synergies, and there'll be some roles that are eliminated, but you have to really actually think hard about what's the right operating model, what's the right place to place talent, where are the best capabilities within the business, and you really have to sort of start from announcement to win hearts and win minds the whole way through. And so it really is just sort of an issue I just think is in a contemporary deal environment has kind of risen to the top of one of the things you really have to pay attention to, and you have to think hard about in a deal environment.
So it's not, as you said, it's not just about synergies. Michael, what's your take on this, on the kind of the macro that's going on here?
Yeah, I think as Jay was describing is, it's really about balance, right? So you have to do some things around synergies. Of course, there's deal value associated with that. But at the end of the day, what you're really trying to do is just make sure that you have the right talent in place, stabilize the organization so it's not distracted from the deal, and then work towards being able to collaborate and innovate together so you're actually maximizing on the long-term benefits of why you had the merger in the beginning.
So Michael, let's just stay with you for a minute. Why is talent so integral for companies to get the most value out of their M&A? Kind of break us down for it. I mean, Jay mentioned what you're buying is almost what's inside of people's brains. So, has that been so important and so integral for companies to get the most value in their deals?
Sure. I think, as Jay was describing, really, as you're doing deals now, you're really buying the assets of the organization, and it's not so much the physical assets, but you're buying the intellectual capital, the intellectual property, and the people, and the scale of those things, and and that varies certainly by deal type that you're getting into, but as you're doing that, things are a little different in an M&A situation versus, let's say, a transformation situation. So, in a transformation situation, you're transforming, you're doing some important things, but everyone assumes they have a job unless you hear otherwise. M&A situation, people are fairly distracted, and the degree of uncertainty of, do I have a job? Where do I fit in the organization? I don't understand the organization. Hugely distracting from your productivity. And so you could be on the spectrum of, well, I can confuse, distract, disengage people, to being on the other side of the spectrum of, I can, help enable collaboration, innovation, and engagement. And those are very different successes versus not in a deal situation. And so what you normally find is that you gotta hit the culture point and figure out how to bring the cultures together. And you got to stabilize the organization so you know where people fit and they have a home, and you have to be able to communicate that home. And then you got to then further harmonize and the talent even further, whether it's how we work together, whether it's harmonizing our total rewards program so people are being paid similarly, or understand, people have the same kinds of titles and so on. So you got to do all these things at pace at the right moments. Otherwise, again, you could buy the assets, but you can certainly not achieve the long-term success that you're trying to get to while you're doing other things simultaneously, such as trying to achieve synergies, some of which are headcount at the same time.
So Jay, you work on M&A deals. Is Michael correct in saying that people do get distracted at the companies, and there is a little bit of maybe even a productivity hit that goes on during M&A deals?
It's all the time, and then you have to expect some of it, but you also need to manage to it. I mean, we used to always I had a story I used to like to tell about a large deal I did it's quite a while ago at this point, but we used to do the parking lot count, and as the months wore on in pre-close planning, and it was getting closer and closer to close, and people didn't necessarily know who had a role, who didn't have a role. You just noticed, like, every morning as a consultant, you'd show up at the same time in the parking lot at this company, and you could park closer and closer to the building. And throughout the summer, it was just fewer and fewer people were there, like, week to week. And, some were out looking for jobs, and some were just taking more time off. And then after they closed the deal and they created certainty about who was in what roles, the parking lot filled right back up. And I always use that as like just a very sort of, physical example of what starts to happen, right? And I think what you're always facing when you're doing an M&A, especially if you do larger deals, it's hard for everybody, because how decisions are made, who's making decisions, when they'll be made, none of that's always immediately clear. And so people are trying to learn how to work together in a pre-close environment and figure some of that out. And they're also trying to figure out what's my future going to be. And so that, it's a really important part of the equation that you've always had to manage, but especially in these environments where you really want to be thoughtful about what talent you do retain in the business, and what kind of roles you create for them, keeping them engaged during it and keep them focused on the business, but also like just keeping them in the door while you're trying to sort out what the right sets of plays matters. And I think in the environment we're on too, a lot of these industries, the mobility of individuals is extremely high. Right. And in some ways, perhaps even in our current environment where we've all learned how to work from home a lot more too, people are even more mobile than ever. And so, you always have this constant, tension of needing to sort of make your way through making some decisions that take some time, but also trying to keep the workforce very engaged, in the daily business and in the process of thinking through integration, and we not be overpromise, who will have a role and who won't have a role. But being in a position where you actually will have choices to make when the time comes, right? So I just think I think Michael kind of got it right. But those are just sort of examples of from sort of how I see it, and I sort of see it play out in different deals.
So yeah, that was a really interesting analogy with the empty parking lot and then the parking lot filling up again. Jay, let me ask you. Let's stay with you for a second. So how should talent approaches differ though, depending on the type of deal? If it's an add-on, if it's a consolidation, or if it's a transformational deal, I guess you kind of have to go in with different type of expectations or different types of approaches. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's not a one size fits all for this, and there are different deal types. I mean, a lot of the add-on deals tend to be sort of, big buy smaller, right? And I work a lot in consumer products, and there's been a lot of, buyouts of small brands, for example. And I think the key in these like little add-on deals is usually you're buying a capability, or you're buying like a very interesting product. Your chances are you're buying a set of individuals who help create that. And but you're not going to be able to sort of run it exactly the way it was run before. And there are going to be things about the larger corporate that you have to impart on it, and some of it's just reporting on the business and the back office and some things like that. And some of it might be, having to evaluate sort of standards that it has and bring them up to a certain level that is commensurate with being part of a larger company and the exposures they can create. But you also have to sort of, you're buying something like a founder company or an innovative company. You don't want to like kill that off either, right? So you bought it for a reason. They created something that's high growth. And so in these add-on deals, like really sort of being, exist, and Accenture actually buys a lot of companies, and we buy, we're probably the most, we actually are one of the most acquisitive firms in the world. And we talk about culture of cultures. We buy a lot of smaller businesses, but we don't necessarily sort of try and change them all overnight. We don't necessarily even change all their brand names. Most of the time, we let them retain sort of these interesting brand trademarks they have in the marketplace. And I think you have to sort of think through for your type of add-on deal. What do you do? A couple other key points on consolidative deals versus transformation deals. I mean, even consolidation deals, which can be very, very high overlap kinds of things, and you do eliminate a lot of roles. I've seen people be very creative about using that as an opportunity to reset the company and really thinking about how to sort of change the culture of a business, and being very thoughtful about the talent mix that they create in that, and very thoughtful about using it as a basis for maybe even making some changes to their operating model. So just because something is consolidated doesn't mean it just one side takes all. I think that's usually that's rarely sort of the best play in those. And I've seen a lot of consolidated deals too, where people actually sort of stop and look, and they actually find hidden capabilities they didn't know existed in the organization they bought. I worked with a couple of home builders after the 2008 financial crisis, and their businesses were obviously massively impaired with the slowdown in the housing market at that time. And it was very consolidated. I mean, they were eliminating lots of sales offices and things like that. But they did sort of discover that the one company is actually a better home builder. They had a better process for building homes. They had sort of done an operations research approach to it, and they had taken thousands and thousands of dollars out of the median home price cost to build by doing that. And had they not sort of stopped and looked around and understood the talent that they had acquired with the business, they would have just rolled right over it. It ended up being like an extremely valuable thing from their deal. And then transformative deals are really sort of the place where you have to sort of think through this most carefully. These are kinds of deals where you're really blending business models, where you might actually be really changing a fundamental operating model of the business, and a new approach to R&D, a new approach to going to market. Maybe you're sort of bringing different kinds of routes to market together in a consumer products business. And in these environments where you're really sort of, it's sort of best, sometimes called best of both, but you're trying to blend the organizations together and a lot of times to drive growth. In those kinds of settings, you have to really sort of think through what are the acquiring businesses going to sort of prevail as like, the case to be, and where are you going to reinvent the business? And around that, you have to really then sort of select and pick what's the right people from both organizations to sort of fill that new organization in the future. So every one of them has like different flavors to it, right? But at the end of the day, you have to have a really thoughtful process about what am I trying to get to as a future end state for my operating model for a company, and then what role does talent play in that, and how do I manage all these interplays we talked about before about keeping people engaged while you're making choices and the like. But you do have to sort of start with what's my deal and what am I trying to achieve? And some of these, like, you might have one mode in one part of the organization and one mode in the other. I've done deals where the back office part is frankly consolidation, and there's not a lot of question about change. And the front of the house is where you're trying to sort of really change how you approach the market and drive growth.
Michael, you have anything to add? That was really interesting. A lot of insights there from Jay on approaches differing depending on the type of deal, add-on, consolidation, or transformational space. Do you see any other thoughts on that topic?
Just a couple of example for instances, right? Just to bring that to life. I think when you start, depending on the deal that you're getting into. So it's one thing if you're a 50,000 person company buying a 200 person company, you start to rationalize quickly, and then you got to figure out what's the value of that. But if you're buying something of scale, of size, going into a new geography, or getting into a manufacturing of a product line that you're not in, it starts to you start to realize, okay, well, what implications really around how much time should I take to integrate? And so sometimes, if you're going to leave alone a little bit longer, you're going to take a little longer to integrate, and that's okay. And other times you're going to want to accelerate that because, there's a high degree of overlap. And so, you have a lot of blended teams, and then it creates confusion if you don't. It's a distraction. And then the other, component of that is, well, if you're now going to get scale in a particular business, geography, or maybe even back office function, it starts to beg the question around, well, how do we look at the operating model of that and say, well, we've made some outsource decisions, for instance. And now that we have this new capability or this scale of talent or whatever it is, how do we revisit those things and really think about that? And that could go in either direction, by the way. And so it allows you to reflect a bit more to get the right operating model, not just, simply, mash up the talent together.
Okay, well, staying with you, Michael, what are you mentioned some of the challenges in your answer just now, but what are some of the the really common challenges companies run into when bringing cultures together after a deal?
Yeah, evaluating culture, happens during due diligence, right? So if you have like cultures that are just never going to blend, you're not going to do the deal because it just will not work. And I get into this. In my past, I was an employee that went through a merger. I day to day, I help companies, integrate their acquisitions, and then inside of Accenture, Jay mentioned how acquisitive we are. Well, one of the people that helps us do due diligence and think about ventures and acquisitions as we go through that, and so culture starts very early on in terms of understanding: is there, can we find a way to work together? Is there enough commonality in the organizations in terms of where their focus is, and you need that anchor so that you can celebrate the things that are in common. And then the rest of it, you find ways of working together. But oftentimes if you don't do the culture part well, that part is gonna result in talent loss. Quite frankly, and that's what you're trying to avoid. And so you can define culture. You can say, look, here are 6 attributes. This is what it means to have a culture. And then you have so now what? How do we, what does this actually mean in practicality in the ways that people work? And so when you're acquiring an organization, everyone can read all the attributes, they can hear the speak, but if they don't actually understand how to get work done in the now combined organization. And by the way, that happens to be for both sides of the organization, right? Because, if you're now part of blended teams or you now have new capabilities, you're asking the question in lots of ways. And so it's really important that we help activate in the right kinds of ways, and versus leave alone and help people figure it out. So we've come up with a culture strategy. Here it is. Now what is not a good answer. It falls under the spectrum of never going to happen to inefficiently happen. And what you want to do is be on the spectrum of really enable and guide. And that really comes down, especially in the middle management ranks. So leadership's all bought in, they totally understand, but then translate it day to day in terms of how middle managers of blended teams in particular can actually help bring the teams together and understand how they would work together through all sorts of things. And then lastly, there's a bunch of distracting things that get in the way that until you integrate those things, you're never going to feel like the same company. And some of those things are, for example, collaboration tools. So someone is on Microsoft Teams, another company is on Zoom. Well, when you send out a calendar invite, it's very visible that you're sending a Teams thing versus a Zoom thing, right? Or even a Skype, both Microsoft products, right? And then it's always a little clunky. It never exactly works right, and all of those kinds of things. And so how team members actually collaborate with each other, especially in this remote environment, is super important to get right and as fast as possible. And then you have other things that are deeply personal to people, like the mobile policy. Mobile phone policy. One company reimburses, the other one doesn't. Or bring your own device. One company allows it, and the other one doesn't. Or they have some other kinds of things. So there's a bunch of things you got to sort of remove the distractions of integrating, as soon as you can without distracting people. And then you got to help people understand the ways of working, especially on blended teams, and then beyond. And you can't just stop at the leadership level.
So Jay, what are your thoughts on common challenges that companies run into when bringing cultures together? And it's interesting, just as a side note, Michael and Jay, it's interesting that Accenture sort of, you eat your own cooking. You do your own deals, and then it seems like you apply some of that knowledge that you do in your own acquisitions to your work helping in the M&A process. So that's kind of interesting how there's there's learning on both sides going on there.
Absolutely, right. And actually capabilities, we have. We have capabilities we built to do our own deal search that we use with our clients as well, right? So it's a very nice reinforcing loop. Look, I think Michael hit some really important points. To me, in culture, it's like the little things that matter the most, but they can become big issues pretty quickly. I actually think one of the most important ones are in early stage M&A is just how do decisions get made, and that sounds strange, like, well, somebody makes them, right? But it's not always intuitive when two companies start to come together, and some are much more consensus driven, and there's a whole bunch of sort of back channel stuff that happens before the meeting, and everybody comes into the meeting and they're all decked up to make the decision. And in other companies, it's very different, and there's like a few key people and they really sort of make all the choices. And in other places they're very used to sort of a very agile scrum kind of bring in the room, let's hash it out and move. And when you sort of bring two groups of people together for the first few times and they don't really understand how that works, it takes some time to work your way through it, right? And it takes effort too, because they start to negative attribute association. Some people will perceive that, well, they're just disruptive. Well, maybe they're not disruptive. It's just that's how decisions get made in their organization, and then it's not how they get made in your organization. And then Michael hit some of the things like, it's like the little policies and the things like that and maybe you might ultimately change them, but I think it's the question of when you do change them, right? Because if some things are like some takeaways or be perceived as takeaways, but I've worked in clients where they have a very strict compliance environment, and there are some policies that they have to impart, right? But how fast you roll them out and how quickly do you sort of make people take training at day one, it sets a tone for the culture you're coming into, right? And if you've got a company that's sort of not used to that, it's like a shock to the system if you hit them too hard, right? So I think it's just, at the end of the day, culture sort of is like always been viewed like this like very soft word, but I think you can break it down into a number of different, very discrete elements. And then it's the choices you make about each of those along the way that really sort of set the tone for like, is this a place that I think I could work in, right? For somebody who's been acquired, that's do I like this group of people? Do I think this is a company I enjoy being in? Is it feel about the same as me? Is it just too bureaucratic and I don't know how to navigate here? Those are the kinds of questions that you want to get people to sort of say, oh, okay, I get it, it's a little different. I'll figure this out, but they're trying to be really helpful. And okay, I get that this feels like a giveaway, but now I understand why it has to be that way. You want to get people to sort of understand versus just assume it's all being inflicted, right? And I think that becomes a really important part of the thing. And I think finding keepers. I had a couple companies I put together a while ago, and one was business casual ahead of its time, and one was like suits and ties. And I think, and that was a big deal. That was a really big deal to both companies, right? And the CEO kind of he bided his time. He didn't do anything fast, but like they got to close, and he just he went to ties optional, right? And he made a point of like you never saw him in a tie again. And at first, his leadership team, they didn't quite get it, and they were kind of still coming in their ties, and and it kind of blended in. And then you saw some of the people from the acquired company every now and then they'd show up in a tie, and they found, but he sort of like took a very symbolic thing at sort of the right point in time, and he sort of made a change around it and made it very visible, and he lived it. And I actually think it actually set a very nice tone as that company came together. And it sounds silly to talk about ties, but that stuff, that's the kind of stuff that people actually get worked up about.
Yeah, definitely. So okay, so Jay, just staying with you for a second, you're talking about really soft stuff about culture. Let's talk about hard technology. What's the role of technology in organizational design? How can companies use data and analytics in their talent approaches during integration?
Yeah, and that's a super exciting topic, and you know, and we're the range of possibilities are just growing by the day. I mean, you know, and really, I think you know, as we do surveys on M&A, I mean, most executives really recognize that using technology as a component of like how you're planning and executing your M&A is just essential to value creation. We think there's a number of ways that it just helps. One, it can really help speed up the process. You know, there used to be the world of you'd print out the org charts and you paste them on the wall, or you create PowerPoints and you're kind of looking at them and you're doing head count and spreadsheets. And it just takes a lot of time and friction, and you can't really, it's hard to sort of very agilely look at design alternatives. And now, you know, with modern tools, you can look at all kinds of different organization designs at a click of a button, and you can take extracts out of Workday and bring in the right kind of people data so that you've got a good understanding of sort of compensation impacts. If you sort of design an organization one way or another, you can do spans and layers like at a click of a button. And so I think what at a very base level, something like that just sort of speeds up what's a necessary process in this. Where it gets super interesting is if you start to bring other sort of capabilities to it, where using job descriptions and things like that in AI, you can start to sort of evaluate options for different kinds of service delivery models and things that you might want to do yourself versus have somebody else do for you, or the kinds of roles based on the description that are actually possible ones that you could do things like RPA on. And then as you sort of click over toward the more of the culture side of the house, some of there's always been like sort of surveys and tools like that, but there's like really interesting things you can do using sort of data in systems, mining calendars to sort of build up views of, what are like the informal networks of the company that really matter, and who are like the influencers, in these organizations that actually could be, really sort of, instrumental in sort of, helping, be, zealots for, the new company, or sort of helping to win those hearts and minds. And so the combination of data available and the analytic tools and capabilities are there, it just becomes very exciting in this space, because it lets you think more expansively about the possibilities. It lets you look at more options. It lets you model your organization in ways that we just never have been able to before. Now, there's always a but. The little but is, things like GDPR, right, and the notion of data, all these like growing nations of data privacy. Is also
GDPR. I'm sorry, GDPR is what again?
Global data privacy, right, which is really sort of an act passed in the EU about individual personal data, and rightfully so. I mean, you really want to protect people's personal information. So as much as we want to use data, you have to use data appropriately, and you have to put safeguards around it. And some of this stuff you end up doing with a few individuals who are allowed to look at it, or you do it in a name blinded, scrambled employee ID kind of way. But I think, but it's very possible to do, right? And so I think as you're working through this, if you ever start finding that, getting the right counsel involved so that you can do the analysis you want to do, leverage modern tools to do it, but do it in a way that sort of protects individual information. You have to balance all of those, but it's still very doable.
Michael, what's your thoughts on technology as well in organizational design? How does it sort of figure into the human equation of what you're working on with your deal making?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think there are lots of purposes of technology to make decisions faster. I think is the way I would couple some of the things that Jay was describing, which had lots of rich examples in there. I'll just add a couple or three examples to that. So one, a very practical example is you're an organization buying another organization, and let's say you're centralized and you're decentralized, or you're both centralized, but you have different services of how you're centralized. How do you even figure out who goes where? So you can even figure out the boxes, right? And so you could use AI, based on titles and job descriptions and other kinds of things to actually ring fence people, make it easier to say, well, these are all the shadow IT people that are sitting in the field somewhere else in country X, Y, and Z, and they should be part of the centralized IT function, because in this company we centralize that work, or we centralize analytics work, and so you can make that kind of decision a lot faster than manually, scanning and looking at some things. Another example is responsible skilling. And so, without a doubt, and there typically are going to be situations where you're going to have to, let some people go. But, they all have skills and capabilities. And so, with AI's help, you can actually figure out what are the adjacent skills that they may have that may fit other kinds of roles that you have. And how long will it take to make them proficient in that? So you can actually, as a company, decide to choose to make some development decisions and reinvest back into a portion of that workforce to actually then fill the talent needs you may have somewhere else. And so there's a lot of different ways of technology really helping you make those things, other than, well, we're just going to go out and just hire a bunch of these people, right? And so there are lots of ways that they can help there. And then once you're ready to actually start to execute on some of this stuff, the way you can use technology for listening to employees, for actually managing the change, understanding the readiness for the change, and all those kinds of things. In Accenture, we use all sorts of tools to actually complement a whole ecosystem of stuff that we do along the way, and it's that collection and that suite and the piecing together to craft the journey is so important, and technology is so critical to just do that at speed and frankly at scale.
So Michael, you're talking about the importance of technology and using AI, for example. It's very interesting. So let's say you have the technology all set. You've been working with this. You've been tweaking it. What's the ideal roadmap for talent integration? So you have all these tools, but what steps do companies need to take to ensure success?
So Steve, it's a good question. With respect to an ideal roadmap, and the answer is, it actually, there's a series of ingredients for different kinds of recipes that need to be brought together, really, because the timing of M&As, they're never neatly when you want them to be, right? There's always, first, companies can be on different fiscal years. They have different timings for talent processes, the annual processes like performance management, comp planning, other kinds of things, right? You have some different timing along the way. So there's a bunch of things that impact people that and depending on when the deal comes in, you have to factor all of those kinds of things. And so there's never like a neat answer, but the way I would describe it, there are a few ingredients that you have to figure out before close, and there's a few ingredients you have to figure out after close. And look, there's probably 20 decisions, 30 decisions you have to make, but just, for today, what are the quick few buckets, if you will. So pre-close, you got to figure out what's the right day one experience, that I want to have to celebrate the commonalities between our cultures, our teams, why this deal, and how do we welcome everybody together, and all of that is really important. Figuring out who you need to, primarily retain or mitigate talent risk against is also really important to start figuring that out fairly early. There's also this nature of cross-functional processes that happen right away. And what I mean by that, Steve, is that, hey, there are open roles that people can take in other organizations. Well, how does that actually happen? Because you're not on the same system on day one. And so does that mean, I got to leave this and my benefits and my title and my grade and my compensation and my service, and now I got to go to this other thing that has a totally different compensation structure, benefit structure, and like how does that physically actually happen? And do I have to, accept the other thing, or does this stuff carry forward? Like all of those decisions and the how of that cross-functional, you got to figure out pretty early on, because you have to operate in this interim period until you're integrated. And then of course you got to figure out your reporting lines day one. Who's reporting to whom? At least at some leadership levels and those kinds of things. Those are important things, as ingredients and lots of decisions and all. And there's more decisions in between those. Those are like the biggies. And then post-close is, you got to figure out, well, how are you going to harmonize all your process and technology things that you're going to do that impact people, especially
That's a big one. That's a big one.
That's a big one. Then you have all these policies, right? And so Jay and I, sprinkled some of those examples in, whether it's the mobile policy whether it's a program for how we do childcare support, whatever the thing is. And then you got all your total rewards. At some point, are we going to be on a common grading structure, titling structure, compensation structure, benefits, all of those kinds of things which take time. It's not immediate, and it may vary. And then you have your annual processes in HR that impact people. So at some point after a deal closes and before you're probably done integrating, you're gonna get to some process where you're gonna say, hey, I have all these people that I thought I was going to promote. Do I still promote these people? Or do I need to scale that back? Or, what does promotion mean? And now this combined company, can I still proceed? There's a bunch of things that really matter to people as you're trying to harmonize. Those things are happening in parallel that you have to layer in to your roadmap. And then, of course, you can't do any of this in a vacuum. You have to factor in, finance, IT, HR, procurement, real estate. They all have to converge, right? In terms of figuring out, and of course, we can't forget about work councils and the timelines associated with working through those things as you're trying to work through your talent roadmap and talent implications. So all of those ingredients, plus the crossovers and the impacts to each other, all have to come together in this integrated way. So and that varies greatly based on deal type and timing and the size and scale of the acquisition.
That's a lot of interesting stuff. There's a lot of work right there, Michael, that you're talking about. Jay, what's your anything you'd like to add on the ideal roadmap for talent integration?
I think, I would just say that, there's a lot of the focus on the day one employee experience. I think that's always great to do, but I would actually go all the way back to, the journey starts when the thing gets publicly announced. And there can be quite a bit of time, for large deals, the average time to close is like 9 months. And if you get any kind of regulatory scrutiny, it can easily be 12 months plus. And I think that period, leading up to close is just as important, because if you don't use that well and you don't sort of address some of these issues along the way quickly, by the time you get to day one, you've probably lost a lot of people in terms of like hearts and minds. So that what you do from announcement to close is just as important as having a big celebration on day one.
Okay, great. Yeah, I wrote about a merger not too long ago that took 2 years to close because they had to get a lot of country approvals and stuff like that. So that's a long time that things can kind of be in limbo, I guess.
Yeah, and that's why you have to also be careful about when do you actually announce leadership, right?
Right.
It provides clarity about who's going to lead the future company, but it also can be destabilizing if you announce it too soon, and that's always a delicate balance as well.
Okay, Jay, let's stay with you. So we've talked a lot about the steps, the roadmaps, the meaning of talent in M&A. Let's try to move on to a couple of examples of how companies are getting it right and the benefits they're achieving as a result. Jay, and then we'll go with Michael. Then we'll wrap it up after that.
Sounds good. Look, I want to give you some common characteristics. I think so. First of all, I think everybody needs to have a strong talent lens on their M&A. And I think when we look at sort of who's doing it right or who's doing well, there's sort of three key things that sort of come to mind. So one is you kind of pick your spots, to leapfrog, because you probably can't change everything in a dramatic way, but you have to really get back to, how am I going to create value in the deal? Am I changing my commercial model? Am I changing my R&D model? What am I changing as a result of this deal to drive growth and drive value? And you really sort of have a bespoke talent agenda around that piece of it that might be differentiated from how you think about other parts of the organization. Two is, really sort of focusing on some of these enablers, like, moments that people will remember that are symbolic of culture, or really enablers. It doesn't have to be something like the guy who got rid of the ties. It can be simple as really having an open discussion about, this is how we make decisions around here. And, how do you guys do it? And how are we going to sort of like help each other out when we sort of feel like a little like we don't quite understand what's going on? How do you make things discussable? But that's just an example of enablers. And then this whole notion of like, hey, just start, stop assuming and start modeling. I mean, there's a lot that you can do with this technology, as we talked about, to actually sort of make really good progress and make good decisions faster. And I think where we sort of seen companies apply those principles, they're really quite successful in this agenda, and it doesn't matter whether it's a large deal or a small deal. I mean, I just worked with a company that bought a brand that was less than $100 million, right? And they signed and closed and had it fully integrated in 90 days, right? But they were actually very conscious from the minute it got announced about embracing the company, engaging the talent. It was very clear that some like the back office and things like that for that business probably was not going to continue. But they treated people well throughout it. They moved very, very quickly. They provided certainty to people as quickly as they could. And the ones that they needed to keep in the business that sort of really understood the product and the brand, were kind of like the heart and soul behind it. They really wrapped them up very, very quickly, right? And that's just a small deal example. We've talked about some larger deal ones. So maybe I'll just see if Michael has other examples he wants to add. But those three things to me are sort of key to the equation.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you're mentioning a lot of these middle market companies as well, not just the mega companies that need to think about these kinds of issues. Michael, what are your thoughts on some good examples of good practices you're seeing out there?
Sure. So I think the kinds of things that we're seeing. Well, first of all, doing it well, if you're going to be an acquisitive company, is super important. Not just to do it well, but actually the reputation. So working with one organization, they're in the midst of integrating, and then they went ahead and bought another company, and that company actually called the other company that were being integrated to find out how their integration experience is going. And that was an important part of their decision making, if they want to join forces or not. And so it's really important, in terms of doing this stuff well, because people are going to care about how their workforce is going to be treated and welcomed and integrated. I think that's one. I think the second thing is boards of companies care about certain types of metrics, and a number of them are talent related. And so, we look at voluntary attrition, we look at engagement, we look at those types of things. We look at, is the product launch, happening on time? Well, all of those things have a people component, and using the right tools around measuring those things, sensing those things, and actually being able to analyze and work through those matters are really important as you need to report out to the board on a regular basis about those types of metrics. And so looking for hotspots, quite frankly. So which is what we do, and we try to understand why that is. And you can heat map all of these metrics across your organization, and instead of treating everything all the same. And so the boards really care about this stuff on the talent side, because they understand without the talent, you're not going to execute on the business metrics.
Okay, well, Michael Benyamin and Jay Neely, thanks for joining us. This has been our Spotlight session, Talent Considerations in M&A. I'm Steve Jelsey, Senior Reporter at The Deal. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.